Welcome to Steele Creek Explorer. I'm your host, Jeremy Stout, and today we are going to learn how to properly plant native trees. All right, well, before we plant our trees today, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the tree basics. In this episode, we're going to talk about some common misconceptions and mistakes that people make. There's a lot of poor information out there, so we're going to show you how to properly plant a tree. But the first question that comes up is when to plant. So the National Arbor Day is in late April every year, but for Tennessee, that's actually pretty late to be planting trees. One of the first mistakes people often make is waiting until springtime to plant a tree. Waiting until the flowers are blooming and the birds are singing and it's sunny and warm outside, and folks think, "Ooh, I want to go plant trees in the yard." Well, realistically, by that point, you've already missed the best planting window by several months. Tennessee's Arbor Day is actually the first Friday in March every year. So that's still wintertime in most people's books. But really, anytime between October and March or April is a perfect window for planting in our region in Northeast Tennessee or Southwest Virginia. So say you're learning this after that planting window. That's not to say that you can't plant trees in the wintertime or in the summer or late fall. But ideally, this very early in the spring is the best time to plant native trees and shrubs in our area. So what kind of trees are we going to be planting here in Steele Creek Park today? Well, I'm very happy to say that thanks to the Tennessee Division of Forestry, part of the Department of Agriculture, and also very special thanks to our Bristol, Tennessee and Virginia Chamber of Commerce, who went after a tree planting grant, we have over 1,300 trees, as 1,300 tree seedlings that are going to be planted in the park and on public lands in Bristol. So we're very excited to plant these trees. And 3 of those are going to get planted today. So what tree species are we going to plant in the park today? Well, as part of the grant that was received by the Bristol, Tennessee Chamber for planting in Steele Creek Park, we're going to be planting over 1,000 what are called riparian trees and shrubs. Those are trees that grow right at the water's edge, or in some cases even in the water. So today we're going to be planting an eastern 9-bark, which is a wonderful species we'll talk more about in a moment. Button bush, which is one of my favorite shrubs that grows in our area. And we're also going to be planting a large at maturity swamp chestnut oak. So each of these tree seedlings, I've got one of each of those species right here, and each of these is roughly the same size. So where should we plant these? Well, we need to learn a little bit about the habitat of each of these species so we know where it's going to fit in best and survive and thrive in its environment. But if you're looking to plant trees or shrubs on your own property, placement is 90% of the process. Deciding where you want to put your tree. Remember, don't plant a tree for today. Plant it for 20 years from today. Even though each of these seedlings are all the same age and they're all roughly the same size, this one's going to be 5 feet at maturity, this one's going to be 8 feet at maturity, and this one is going to be more than 100 feet at maturity. Okay, so a couple of these might be okay to put close to the power lines. This one definitely is not one of them. So know a little bit about your tree and what its dimensions are going to be when it gets to maturity before you put it in the ground. That's the #1 thing you can do to maintain the long-term success of your plantings. So enough talking about it. Let's go ahead and put these trees in the ground. Okay, we're on our way to plant our first shrub seedling, our Eastern 9-bark. And as you can see here, we have some erosional concerns that hopefully these plants will help us address. But also going back to site selection and knowing your species before you plant them. As you can see in Steele Creek Park and many of our other localities in this region, trees and shrubs now have to contend with a potential threat that they haven't had to deal with in over 100 years. The American beaver, Castor canadensis, is making its way back to this area where it had previously been extirpated. And here you can see some damage that the beaver has caused. But luckily, if you select your species correctly, believe it or not, there are many trees and shrubs that grow at the water's edge that can actually benefit from the gnawings of beavers. And a lot of the shrubs tend to have that habit, as we call it. So here you can see, oftentimes beavers will take central trunks off of trees and shrubs. But what happens when you cut a shrub species? Oftentimes it bushes back. And so you see that time and time again. Here is some Eastern 9-bark that we planted a couple of years ago. It's done very well. It's actually survived beaver gnawings and has come back bushier as a result of their activities. So some trees and shrubs beavers would absolutely kill and take away, and that would be no good to plant them right at the water's edge. But both buttonbush and Eastern 9-bark are considered beaver-safe species. Well, as I mentioned, the most common mistake people make when they're planting trees on their own properties is planting in the wrong place, an improper site for the tree species that you've chosen. What I would argue is the second most common mistake that's made when the tree is being planted is digging the hole incorrectly. Here we have the first tree we're going to plant is this Eastern 9-bark. This is a lovely shrub that gets 8 to 10 feet tall. It grows bushy. It survives beaver activity fairly well. And here you see what looks like dangling from the central trunks are more roots than trunk. And so you might be tempted to think, oh goodness, we need to plant this as deep as the roots go. But in fact, that's actually not the case. Holes being dug to plant trees in, width is much more important than depth. It's a common misconception that trees have a taproot that goes forever and lasts the entire life of the tree. In fact, most tree species don't have a central taproot, at least when they're mature. And with all tree species, the most important roots that the tree has are the ones that actually spread out from the base of the trunk of the tree and are usually found in the top few inches of soil. That's right, the most important roots to watch out for with any tree seedling that you're planting are the ones that are going to stay shallow in the hole that you dig. So that means that digging the hole relatively shallow, but as wide as you can reasonably accommodate is the best first start you can give to your new tree. All right, so some of you might call me crazy, but nope. That is the perfect depth hole for our 9-bark tree seedling here. All right, so another thing you can do when you first place your tree, since I do have the water right here at my disposal, I'll go ahead and give it a little drink before I put it in. One thing that tends to happen when you dig a hole is sometimes when you put your shovel or your spade in the earth, it has a tendency to smooth the sides of the soil. That's especially common with red clay soils that we have in this area so commonly. If that happens, it's a very good idea to try to bust up that soil. It's called glazed sides. And what happens is, if you don't do that, if you don't score the sides of your hole, is you've effectively created a barrier that sometimes the roots of growing plants cannot penetrate. It acts as almost like they encounter a brick when they get to the side of the hole. So I don't encounter that here. It looks like it's nice loose soil for the most part.
And we are going to position this shrub as we think it's going to best survive and be oriented. And we're going to go ahead and start to bust up this soil. And start to add it back to the hole. So what if you have nursery stock? What if you've bought a tree at one of the local hardware stores or your local nursery or plant grower? Lots of questions come up about soil amendments, or should you add anything to the soil? Should you use the stuff that the tree came in? If you bought a potted plant, should you add that back to the hole, or should you discard it? And if you ask 51 different professionals that question, you'll probably get 100 different answers. Everybody's got a different idea and different opinion on it. If you want mine, my belief is that it's best to go ahead and establish your tree in the conditions that it's going to call home. I don't add a bunch of extra stuff to the site because that just adds as a crutch to the new tree, generally speaking. If you have some soil chemistry issues that you need to address, then you need to handle that on a case-by-case basis. But for the most part, I plant my trees and shrubs directly in the soil that I expect them to grow in. And so that way you're not starting their life off needing something that's not going to be available to them later in their life. All right, and normally I wouldn't add the grass back. Grass is actually a major competitor of some of our trees and shrubs, but in this case I'm going to try to hide this disturbance a little bit, and also hope to prevent some of the erosion that might put some of this mud in the lake, which is where we don't want it to go. If I had a little bit of mulch today, I might go ahead and put just a little bit of mulch around the tree seedling, not much. You don't build it up like a big volcano, and you don't take it around the edge like that looks like a donut. You see that sometimes. Nope, just a very thin, even layer of mulch just around the drip line of the tree, which for this small seedling would be very tiny. And that's it. You're done. All right, well, I've just shown you how to properly plant a tree. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to improperly plant this one. So the ideal way to plant the tree is width is more important than depth, and we learned all that. But sometimes your planting site has different ideas. This seedling we're going to plant is buttonbush, which is an excellent wetland species. It doesn't have to have soggy ground all the time. It actually can grow in a diverse array of sites. But this plant is unique in that it can grow in standing water. And so it makes this plant a very good plant to help with soil erosion, to help hold on to banks, and you can actually plant it in shallow water. So here on the earthen causeway that crosses the lake at Steele Creek Park, we have some erosional issues. And so I've not been able to just dig a hole in the lake bed because we have these steep sides, but I am going to experiment with putting this buttonbush in a very narrow, not much more than a gash that we've put in the earth, and monitor it and see how it does over future seasons. Okay, so this is a problematic planting site right off the bat. One, we've got this erosion control fence in our way, but also I'm going to experiment planting this buttonbush in this area of shoreline. It's not the best soil in the world. It's the red clay that many of us are so familiar with. And I want to be extra careful to not calve off this chunk of causeway into the lake. The whole point of this grant and this planting is to plant these species that are going to help control erosion, to help hold on to shoreline. So I don't want to make that problem worse by trying to plant this tree. Got those roots covered. All right, it doesn't look the best, but there you have it, how not to plant a tree. Although in this case, as I mentioned, the potential reward of this tree, if it does okay here, should outweigh the risk of us not being able to plant it properly today. All right, here's our final tree we're going to plant today. I'm really excited to see how this is going to work. This is a tree that does occur in our area, but it's also a tree that you find more commonly in deeper south and more swampland areas. This is a swamp chestnut oak. It's a wonderful tree. It's great for wildlife, produces acorns that are a favorite by many of the mast-eating species. But it's also good. It doesn't have to grow directly in the water, of course. But it is a species that can tolerate periodic flooding and a range of soils as long as it doesn't dry out completely. So this, of course, being an oak tree, it is large at maturity, and it will have a large spreading crown and a large spreading root system that'll hopefully work wonders to help hold on to this soil that we're trying to repair here at the lakeside. Let's check our test. All right, perfect. What you always want to look if you're planting a tree, whether this is from nursery stock or a seedling that's really little like this one is, of course it's going to grow to be large, is to always look for something called the trunk flare. That's actually something that you've probably noticed, even if you didn't know that it had a name, is most trees, when they come down right where they meet the soil, there's a little outward projection as it comes to the ground. That's called the trunk flare, and you always want that to be above the ground. So everything below that is roots. And so in the case of this little oak tree here, we're going to get it at just the right depth to where the actual trunk tissue and that trunk flare will be above the soil, but everything else will be below it. Make sure that trunk flare is exposed at the surface. That's 3 trees planted. All right, that's 3 tree seedlings planted, 1,497 to go. I don't think you want to see us plant all of those over the next however many hours it's going to take. But I do encourage you to plant trees in your home and in parks, as long as you're doing so with the appropriate permissions. But we covered a few things here today, but there are some other things to keep in mind as well. Let me go ahead and mention it again, even though we already showed you. Right tree, right place is the first most important parameter you need to look at. And second, remember, we dug our holes wide for the size of the tree that we were planting, but comparatively shallow. 3 times as wide as the root or as the canopy, if you can conceivably dig your hole that wide. So whenever possible, plant native. There's no better way to know that your tree is going to survive in this area and the site you choose than if it's already a tree that belongs in this region. So plant native. We've got a number of beautiful flowers and fruiters, and that's always a good way to help our local wildlife, is to plant native trees and shrubs. Research, research, research. Ask yourself, what do you want the tree to do for you? Is it a canopy that you want for shade sometime in the future? Do you want a hedgerow? Do you want a privacy fence? Well, not all species will work for all potential uses. So do the research in advance to find out what kind of trees will serve the purpose that you want them to serve. And lastly, have fun and get into nature, because that's where you can be the explorer.